There are two kinds of silence in a clock shop. The first is the silence before you set the pendulum. That held breath. The whole room waiting to see if the thing you spent 11 hours rebuilding will actually keep time once the weight drops, and the escape wheel decides whether it trusts you. The second is the silence after you have heard everything, and decided to say nothing. I learned to love the second one. It is the more durable silence. The first one breaks the moment the clock starts. The second one you can carry out of the room and keep. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 44 years old. I'm a horologist. I restore antique clocks for a living. People hear that and they picture a tiny old man with a loop and a bad back, squinting at a gear the size of a fingernail. I'm neither old nor a man, but the loop is accurate and my back is not what it was, and the fingernail gear part is unfortunately exactly right. I restore things that other people broke, or forgot, or let die slowly in an attic where the temperature swung 30 degrees between noon and midnight. That is the whole job. You take something that stopped. You find the one tooth that was forced out of place. You put it back where it was always meant to be. And then you wind it, and you set the time, and you let it run without you. A good restoration is invisible. Nobody applauds the clock for ticking. It just ticks. That is the point. You are not supposed to be in the story. You are supposed to be the reason the story continues without you in it. My father used to say that about people too. He said a family is a movement. Every piece has a home. You force one gear to turn another that was never built to turn, and the whole thing seizes, and then it sits there looking fine from the outside while nothing inside it moves. He was right. I just didn't know how right until the year he died, and until the woman who married him decided I was the easiest gear to remove. Here is what my stepmother didn't know when she decided I was easy to erase. A clock keeps a record. Not the kind you can delete, not the kind you can forge. The kind pressed into brass, scratched into a plate, hidden under a dial, where only someone who has taken the whole thing apart, who has held every one of its 200 pieces in their palm, will ever think to look. Those words meant nothing. The afternoon she told me the workshop was no longer mine. They would mean everything. I'm going to tell you the whole thing. I'm going to tell it the way I tell a movement. Slowly, in order, without raising my voice. Because the louder a person gets, the more certain I am that they are afraid of what the mechanism will say once it's running again. People who are sure they're right don't shout. People who are afraid they're wrong do. There's something you should know before I begin, because it's the thing that explains why I didn't scream when I should have. My father left me 47 clocks. Carolyn, his second wife, the woman who labeled his shelves and learned none of his language, left me nothing but a locked door and a story about how I had abandoned him in his illness. The story was a lie. The door, unfortunately, was real, and the lock on it was new, and the key in my pocket no longer turned anything. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was a number, and numbers are the only thing in this story I trust completely. 47 clocks, appraised at $312,000, signed over to her son Marcus, 11 months before my father stopped being able to sign his own name, on a deed notarized by a woman whose license had already expired. I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew the workshop smelled wrong the last time I stood in it, and a horologist trusts her nose before she trusts her lawyer. It always smelled of linseed oil and beeswax, and the particular metallic tang of old brass warmed by a shop heater that coughed in February. That day it smelled of somebody else's perfume and the cold of a room that hadn't been worked in for a while, the way an uninhabited house smells of its own absence. A clock shop that has gone quiet is the saddest room in any house. The ticking stops first in your ears and then, if you stay long enough, in your chest. I'm Eleanor Vance. I restore what was forced to stop. And in the spring of the year my father died, something in my own family had been forced to stop for a very long time, and I was the only one who knew how to open the case and find the broken tooth. If you're new here, my name is Eleanor, and on this channel I tell the stories that didn't get a loud ending, the ones where the person who was wronged simply went back to work and let the results speak. If this is your first time, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're in and what time it is where you are. I read them. I really do. Some of you are listening at 3 a.m. with a clock ticking in the next room, and I know exactly how that feels, because for most of my life there has been a clock ticking in the next room, and most of the time it was the only honest thing in the house. Now let me take you back to the winter. The ticking in our house started to change, and to the man who taught me that you can love a thing without owning it, and that you can be erased from a will without ever being erased from the brass. Let me take you back to January of 2019. My father was 71. I was 37. He had been collecting clocks since he was a boy with a broken pocket watch and a screwdriver he wasn't supposed to touch. The kind of boy who takes things apart to find out whether they'll go back together, and who, against all odds, turns out to be the kind who can. By the time I was born, the collection lived in a brick workshop behind our house at 218 North 3rd Street, a narrow building he'd bought for $9,000 in 1986 and insulated himself badly, over 3 winters, swearing the whole time and getting fiberglass in places. Fiberglass should never be. The workshop was always 64 degrees in winter. He refused to heat it more. Brass expands, he'd say, tapping the dial with a knuckle. You let a movement get warm and lazy and it won't tell you the truth. Cold brass is honest brass. My father trusted temperature more than he trusted most people, and looking back, the people he shouldn't have trusted would have done well to be as steady as his thermometer. I learned the trade standing on a milk crate next to his bench, because I was too short to see over it and too stubborn to leave. He taught me to read a serial number before he taught me to read a chapter book. The first clock I ever took apart was a Seth Thomas wall regulator he'd rescued from a demolished courthouse in 1979. A clock that had timed the marriages and bankruptcies of a whole county and then been thrown in a dumpster, and which he fished out because, he said, time deserves better than a dumpster. I was 9. I lost a screw. He made me sweep the entire floor with a magnet until I found it, and I found it, under the bench, and he said, "Good. Now you know the first rule. Nothing in this room is lost until you stop looking." Starngen was wrong. That regulator still hangs in the shop. It ticks at 3:14 in the afternoon, every afternoon, because that's when he set it the day he brought it home, and neither of us ever changed it. Not in 40 years, not when the courthouse fell, not when my mother died, not when the dementia came. 3:14 is the truest thing in the building. There are 2 kinds of clock people, and I've met both. There are the ones who want the clock to be worth something, who see a movement as a price tag with gears. And there are the ones who want the clock to be true, who see the price tag as an accident and the ticking as the point. My father was the second kind. I am the second kind. Carolyn, I would learn across 16 years of Sundays, was very much the first, and Marcus, her son, was the first kind's laziest student. Let me tell you about the collection, because the collection is the whole argument and the whole wound. 47 clocks. Not a random pile amassed by a man with too much time. A life arranged by decade, each clock a year he'd survived and marked. The 1923 Vance Regulator No. 1, that my grandfather Henry built by hand and gave to my father at his wedding, the keystone, the heirloom, the thing with 3 generations of initials pressed into it where no thief would ever think to look. A 1948 Atmos that ran on nothing but the temperature change of the room around it, a clock that needed no winding because it fed on the air. My father's favorite, because he said it was the only honest machine, taking only what the world freely gave. A 1962 electric that my real mother, Catherine, had wound every Sunday until the cancer took her when I was 6, a clock she loved the way some people love a song, for no reason anyone could defend and every reason that mattered. My mother loved that electric clock. She'd sit in the sunroom with it and listen, and she'd say, "Your father fixes time, I just try to notice it passing." She died in April, the lilies by the window still in bloom, and the clock kept ticking because clocks do not know about April or lilies or the people who loved them. I think my father never wounded again himself after she died. He let it run until the spring gave out, and then he put it on a high shelf where he could see it but not have to touch it, the way you keep a letter you can't bear to open. I remember that shelf. I remember the smell of the sunroom, cut grass, and the faint sweetness of those lilies, and the warm dust of a room where a sick woman had spent her last quiet months. I remember thinking, at 6 years old, that if I wound the clock hard enough she might come back, because 6-year-olds believe in leverage the way adults believe in lawyers. I wound it so hard the mainspring groaned, a sound I can still hear, and my father took it gently from my hands. Gently. Always gently. And said, "Easy, Ellie. You force a movement and it stops. You let it and it keeps going for someone else." He was teaching me the only rule that would ever matter to me, the rule that would save the collection and, in a way, save me. I just didn't have the words for it yet, because I was 6, and because the words for the most important things always arrive after the lesson, never during it. By 2019, the collection was worth, on paper, $312,000. But paper is the part Carolyn understood, the part with columns and signatures and the comfortable illusion of finality, The other part, the part pressed into brass, the part in the ledger, the part in the marks no appraiser would ever think to look for, was mine, and she never learned to read it, and that gap between what she could read and what was true is the entire distance between her plan and her failure. My father married Carolyn in the spring of 2003. I was 22, freshly hired at a restoration firm, and trying very hard not to need him, which is what daughters do when they love a father who is starting to need them. Carolyn was a gallery assistant he'd met at an estate sale, the kind of woman who knew the price of everything and the weight of nothing, who could tell you the maker's mark on a silver spoon and nothing about the hand that made it. She was 41 then. She had a son, Marcus, from a previous marriage. Marcus was 1-4, and already, even at 1-4, the kind of boy who counted what was his and never counted what he owed. I want to be fair to Carolyn, because fairness is part of the craft, and because I will not become the person who lies about the person who lied about me. She was not unkind in the beginning. She organized the workshop, labeled the shelves in a confident black marker, grouped the clocks by maker instead of by the decade my father preferred, which told me everything about how she saw the room. She made my father eat vegetables. She made the house less lonely for a widower who had spent 19 years talking to clocks instead of people. For about 4 years, the house was quieter and cleaner, and my father looked less like a man keeping himself company with ticking. I will give her that. I will give her only that, and I will give it without resentment. Because resentment is a forced gear, and it seizes the person who carries it. But here is the thing about a movement you didn't build: you can label the shelves all you want, you can alphabetize the makers and dust the cases and learn the prices, but you don't know which gear carries the load. Carolyn labeled. She never learned to listen. And a clock you can't listen to is a clock you will eventually try to sell. There were 2 children in that house, in a manner of speaking, though only one of us was his. There was me, the one who learned the trade, who came every Sunday without being asked, who could tell you why a clock gained 9 seconds a day and how to cure it with a bend of the crutch no thicker than a hair. And there was Marcus, who learned nothing, who came never, who could tell you the resale value of a mahogany case and nothing about the movement inside it, who at 1-4 could already price a thing and at 30 still could not value one. My father loved us both, badly, in the way fathers of complicated families do. The way you love the child who stayed and the child who left, with different shapes of guilt for each. He taught me the brass, he bought Marcus a car. Neither of us complained, exactly. I got the better gift and he got the easier one, and we both knew it without saying. But I noticed, early and with a clarity that aged into certainty, that Marcus was being trained to inherit things and I was being trained to fix them. There is a difference between those 2 trainings, and it matters more than people admit, because the person trained to inherit learns to wait, and the person trained to fix learns to see, and in the end, the person who can see will always find what the person who can only wait has tried to hide. There was a clock in the collection I haven't told you about yet, because every collection has one clock that is less an object than a person, and this one was my father's conscience made of glass and gas. The 1948 Atmos, the one that ran on nothing but the temperature of the room around it, needing no winding because it fed on the air itself, sat on his workbench, never on a shelf, because he said a clock that asked for nothing belonged among the hands that worked, not the dust that collected. He taught me to read it the way you read a person, not by what it did, but by what it didn't require. Most machines want to be wound, he told me when I was 12 and impatient with anything that didn't move when I touched it. This one wants nothing. Learn the difference between what wants to be fed and what just runs. The second one is the only one you can trust, Ellie, and you'll meet both kinds before you're done. I didn't understand until later that he was describing the people in the house as surely as the clocks. Carolyn wanted to be fed, attention, security, a name on a deed, a story in which she was the wife who saved the day. The Atmos just ran. My father was the Atmos. And I, unwinding by degrees through the years of his illness, was learning to become one, the kind of person who needs nothing from the people who want everything. The 2009 flood is the reason the collection is documented the way it is, and the reason Carolyn's up to 200,000 was always a fantasy wearing the costume of a number. That spring, the neighbor's basement took on 9 inches of water in an overnight storm, and my father, who had lost one clock to a leak in 1988 and never recovered from the superstition, spent the next 3 weekends moving all 47 clocks to the second floor of the house and photographing everyone against a white sheet with a ruler for scale. 9 of the clocks had survived water damage in that 1988 leak, a 1955 cuckoo, 2 schoolhouse regulators, a carriage clock with a cracked porcelain dial, 4 wall timepieces, and the Seth Thomas he'd rescued from the courthouse. He logged each survival and each scar in the ledger, and he made me initial every entry, because he said a record you don't sign isn't a record, it's a hope. That flood is why the insurance was individual and not blanket, why the cereals were mine to produce, why the provenance the auction house assumed was paper was actually a decade of photographs and initials pressed into brass. Carolyn saw a collection. I held the evidence. The flood that scared my father into documenting everything is the same flood that drowned her plan, 16 years later, which is the kind of symmetry a horologist appreciates and a thief never sees coming. In 2011, my father had a small stroke, not the dramatic kind that empties a room, the kind that takes a word out of a sentence and puts a different one back, the kind that makes him set the regulator at 3:15 one afternoon and not notice it was wrong, the kind that teaches a daughter to watch. I noticed. I reset it to 3:14. He laughed, a little confused, and said, "You're the only one who keeps my time, Ellie." I didn't know then that he was naming me steward without the paper to prove it. In 2014, the vascular dementia diagnosis came. Early, the neurologist said, manageable. Manageable is a word doctors use the way Carolyn would later use family, to describe something that is already slipping, politely, while everyone in the room pretends the floor isn't tilting. Over the next 3 years, I watched my father become a clock whose mainspring was slowly unwinding, not all at once but in increments small enough to deny. He forgot the names of tools he'd used for 50 years. He remembered, perfectly and with tears, the day in 1961 he rode his bicycle 12 miles to buy the Atmos because the man at the shop said it couldn't be restored. He could not remember whether he had eaten lunch. The gap between what he knew and what he knew widened by the month. And I learned to live in that gap with him, the way you learn to live in a cold workshop, by not expecting the temperature to change. I came every Sunday. I brought coffee, black, the way he liked it, in a thermos I still own. I wound the clocks he could no longer reach, the tall case in the corner, the one that weighed 40 pounds and needed a step stool he was no longer allowed to climb. I logged every restoration in the ledger he'd started in 1974, a fat black binder, its spine taped twice, with 1 page per clock, every serial number in his careful hand, every repair dated, every tiny mark I made, so that years later I would know a clock was the one I had touched, and not a substitute slid in by someone who didn't know the difference. That ledger is the reason this story has an ending I can live with. Not the drama, the ledger. The quiet, repetitive, unglamorous habit of writing down what you did and when you did it. If you take one thing from this whole story, take that, keep the record, even when it feels like nothing is happening. Especially then. Carolyn became his power of attorney in 2015. It was the right call, medically and legally. She was the wife. I was the daughter 3 towns over, and someone needed to sign for the pills and the chairs and the slowly accumulating paperwork of a body failing in increments. I did not fight it. I was his daughter, not his accountant, and I trusted. There is the word that undoes half the people in these stories, the word that turns a locked door into a surprise. I trusted that the woman who had labeled his shelves loved the man who owned them. Marcus, meanwhile, drifted in and out of the house like a weather front that never quite broke. He consulted. He was always between things, the way some men are always between jobs and always somehow between someone else's money. He developed a sudden interest in the workshop around 2017, the year my father stopped being able to climb the step into it. Convenient, that interest, arriving exactly when access required a helper and not a key. Marcus would organize, he would take inventory. He asked me once, very casually, whether the clocks were insured as a collection or individually, the way you ask a question you already half know the answer to because you're building a plan and not a conversation. I told him individually because my father had insisted on it after a 2009 flood in the neighbor's basement made him paranoid about water, in a way only a man who'd lost one clock to a leak could be. Marcus nodded and wrote something in his phone, the cold little click of his thumbnail against the screen, and I remember thinking it was odd that a man who didn't care about clocks cared so much about their paperwork, the way you notice a stranger studying the exits. The smell of the workshop in those years changed by degrees, the way the temperature did, until you couldn't say exactly when it had shifted. The linseed oil was still there, faithful as ever. but under it came the scent of Marcus's cigarettes, and Carolyn's perfume, and a kind of absence, the absence of a man who used to hum while he worked, a hum I hadn't realized I'd been listening for until it stopped. A clock shop with no one humming in it is just a room full of stopped time, and a house with no one humming in it is something sadder and harder to name. I have a clear memory from the spring of 2017, the last spring the workshop was mine to enter without asking. Marcus came to help on a Sunday. I was there, and he stood in the middle of the room with his phone out, filming the cases the way a person films a thing they're already imagining selling. My father, in the corner, hummed a fragment of a song from 1961, and Marcus said, loud enough to be kind and quiet enough to be cruel, "Dad, you really collected a lot of junk." My father didn't hear him or pretended not to, which is its own kind of mercy. I heard him. I said, "That's a 1923 regulator your grandfather built. That's a 1948 Atmos that doesn't need winding. That's not junk. That's a century." Marcus laughed and said, "To you." And he was right, in the worst way. To him it was a lottery ticket with 47 numbers, and to me it was a sentence my father had been writing my whole life. He left after 9 minutes. I stayed 3 hours, the way I always did, winding what he could no longer reach and writing what no one else would. 9 minutes and 3 hours. That ratio is the whole story of who loved what, and the ledger remembers the 3 hours and the phone remembers the 9, and I made sure the ledger outlasted the phone. Let me tell you about the Vance regulator number 1, because it is the keystone of everything, and the proof of everything, and the thing Carolyn could forge a deed around but could never forge itself. My grandfather Henry built it in 1923, in a rented room above a haberdashery. During the winter his own father died. He built it to have something that kept going when everything around him had stopped, which is the only honest reason to build anything. He engraved the back plate by hand, letter by shaky letter. H. Vance, 1923, for T, who will keep it. He gave it to my father at his wedding in 1965. My father gave it to me, in trust, the year I turned 30, not as a gift, as a charge, the way his father had charged his. "You keep it running," he said, setting my hands on the case. "A Vance made this. A Vance keeps it. Don't you ever let a bell touch it." He was joking, mostly. He was also not joking at all. I restored it in 2009 after the flood scare. Taking it completely apart, 214 separate pieces, I counted them twice the way he taught me, once for the number and once for the habit. And when I put it back together, I scratched a mark only a restorer would make. A tiny E inside the barrel arbor, visible only with a loupe. Only if you knew to look, the way my grandfather had made his own mark, an H on the escape wheel, and my father had made his, a T on the pendulum bob. 3 generations, each pressing our initials into the same moving thing. A century of us agreeing, without ever meeting, that this clock was ours and true and not for sale. That clock is not, by any definition, a probate court would honor or a thief would respect, Carolyn's to give, or Marcus's to receive, or a deed's to move. But she tried to give it anyway. They always try. Here is a detail I did not understand at the time and now cannot forget. The kind of detail that later becomes the whole case. In the fall of 2018, Marcus asked me to look at the regulator because Mom thinks it's losing time. I went. The clock was fine. It was keeping 3:14 exactly, the way it had for decades, the way it will after I'm gone. But I noticed a fresh fingerprint on the dial glass. Marcus's, I assume, the oily print of someone who handles things he doesn't understand, and a tiny scrape on the case where someone had tried, clumsily, to pry the back off without knowing where the screws were, because you do not pry a Vance regulator, you know where the screws are, or you do not touch it, and the scrape told me everything about who had been handling my inheritance. It told me they were in a hurry, it told me they did not know what they held, and it told me they would hurt the thing to get at the paper. I fixed the scrape as best I could, with a little tinted wax and a steadier hand than I felt, and I said nothing. I said nothing because my father was in the next room, and because saying something would have meant starting a war in a house that was already losing its owner one sentence at a time, and because I had learned, from 1,000 quiet workshops, that the time to speak is after you have the movement in your hand, not before. But I wrote it down, date, time, what I saw, in the ledger, because that is what a horologist does. We keep the record even when we keep the silence, and the silence is only safe if the record is complete. That winter, my father signed things. I don't know what all he signed. Carolyn handled the paperwork the way she handled the vegetables, efficiently, and without inviting me to the table, I was told he had updated his wishes. I was not shown the wishes. I was told gently that he was tired and that we shouldn't burden him, which is the kindest sentence a person can use to exclude you, and the most effective. There are two ways to steal from a sick man, and I had read about both in books, and now I was living the second. You can take what he has, or you can convince the people who love him that asking is a burden. Carolyn mastered the second one first, and the first one followed more easily once the asking had stopped. By the spring of 2019, the workshop door had a new lock. I had the old key, the brass one on my ring since I was 16. The new lock was a small, ugly modern deadbolt that did not match the 1924 hardware. A deadbolt that said, in the plain language of hardware, that someone had decided the room was now a place with a boundary and not a place with a welcome. I stood in the gravel yard one Sunday and turned the old key and felt it catch on nothing, the hollow click of a key that no longer belongs to anything, and I knocked. Carolyn answered. She was pleasant, the way people are when they are in the right and know they aren't. She said the workshop was being assessed for insurance and that my father wanted it secured, which was a sentence only a person who had never been in that workshop on a Sunday could say, because my father had never wanted it secured against me, only against the weather and the occasional raccoon. I said, he always kept it open for me. She said, he's not himself, Eleanor. You have to understand. He's worried you'll take things. The lie was so clean it almost sounded like care, the way a forged signature almost looks like the hand that wrote it. My father had never in his life worried I would take a thing. He had worried I would forget to put one back. He had taught me that losing a screw was the only true loss. Carolyn had rewritten him into a man who feared his own daughter, and the rewrite was the cruelty, not the lock. I said nothing. I looked at the deadbolt, its ugly new face, its untouched strike plate, the way it made a 1924 door lie about who was welcome. I walked to my car, I drove home and I wrote it down, the date and the time and the exact words, because by then I understood, without yet knowing why, that the record was the only thing no one could lock. That was the pattern for the next year. Sunday visits moved from the workshop to the kitchen, and the workshop stayed locked. And my father, when I saw him, was softer and slower and more himself in flashes and less in stretches. The way a clock runs down, not stopping all at once, but losing the seconds until you notice the hour is wrong. He called me Catherine once, which broke me quietly and rebuilt me the same afternoon, because he had called me by his dead wife's name and meant, I think, the person who stayed. He apologized. I told him it was all right. He said, your mother loved that electric clock. I said I knew. He said, don't let it stop. I said I wouldn't, and I didn't know then that don't let it stop would become the sentence I built my whole response around, the sentence I would repeat to myself the way you repeat a regulating instruction, softly, daily, until the clock agrees. In the summer of 2019, Marcus listed the collection with an auction house in the next county. Not individually, the way it was insured, but as a lot. 47 clocks collapsed into one number, one check, one buyer who would never know which gear carried the load. The estimate they sent Carolyn promised up to $200,000 if the provenance held, which was the auction house's polite way of saying the price depended entirely on a story being true. The provenance was the problem, and the problem was me. 47 clocks, and only a handful had clean paper. Bills of sale, appraisals, the tidy documents Carolyn understood. The rest were proven by the ledger, by my father's handwriting, by the marks pressed into brass that no auction house and no buyer and no probate court would ever think to look for, because looking for them requires taking the clock apart, and taking a clock apart requires loving it more than pricing it. Carolyn's up to $200,000 assumed a buyer who trusted her story. I was the only person alive who could prove the story was half invention, and the clocks were 3/4 mine by every measure that wasn't on the paper. I found out about the auction because the auction house emailed my father's old address and CC'd me by mistake. His account still had me as a secondary contact from a 2016 insurance update I'd handled, the last piece of paperwork I'd been allowed to touch, and the one that would undo them. The email said, Re the Vance lot. Confirm the number 1 is included per the gift deed. Gift deed. I read those 2 words in a Starbucks at 9:02 on a Tuesday morning, and the room got very quiet, the way a shop gets quiet when a movement stops mid-swing and you realize the silence is the alarm. I had never heard of a gift deed. My father had never mentioned a gift deed. There was no gift deed in anything he'd ever shown me, and he had shown me everything. The will from 2003, the codicil from 2011, the insurance, the ledger, the key, the charge he'd laid on me at 30. A gift deed meant the collection had been given, not willed, given while he was alive. Given most likely while he was not able to know what a signature was for, which is the precise definition of a theft dressed as a gift. Those words meant nothing in the Starbucks, surrounded by people ordering things and forgetting them. They would, later, they would mean a year of my life, and the difference between a workshop that was mine and a workshop that was a lie. I called Carolyn. I kept my voice even, the way I keep my hands when I'm about to open a movement I've never opened. Calm, because panic strips the screws. I asked, as if curious, "There's an email about a gift deed for the clocks. I'm not familiar with that. Can you help me understand?" She was smooth. She had practiced this answer. She said, "Oh, honey, your father wanted Marcus to have the collection. He signed it. It's all handled. It's been such a relief not to worry about it." Relief, she said. The word a person uses when they have removed something they were afraid you'd notice missing. Signed it when? Last spring. He was so clear about it. You know how he got about the workshop near the end. Last spring, 11 months before the email. 11 months after the dementia had taken the part of him that knew what a signature was for, the part that could still write the loop on the V my grandfather had taught him. I said, "I'd like to see the deed," she said. "It's with the lawyer. Everything's with the lawyer, which is what people say when everything is not with the lawyer but with the plan." I said, "Send me a copy." She said she would. She did not. She would not. Because a copy is the one thing a forged thing cannot survive, and she knew it the way I would later prove it. That was the moment I stopped being the daughter who trusted and became the horologist who opens the case, not loudly, quietly. The way you unscrew a dial, from the edges with the right tool, never forcing, because a forced dial cracks and a patient one comes free. I did not tell Carolyn I was looking. I did not tell Marcus. I went to the county records office the next morning, because a gift deed of titled personal property gets recorded, and recorded things leave a fingerprint a careful person can find. The way a cleaned clock still shows the wear of the hand that wound it. I pulled the deed. It was dated the 14th of March 2018, 3:14, the regulator's hour, though that was only a coincidence that would later feel like a message from a man who could no longer send one. It transferred the clock collection known as the Vance Collection, together with the workshop at 218 North 3rd Street and all fixtures therein, from Theodore Vance to Marcus Bell. Bell, Marcus, had taken Carolyn's maiden name somewhere along the way, or used it for the deed, or let someone use it, a small detail and a telling one. My father's name was not Bell, my name was not Bell. The collection had been Vance for 100 years, and the deed made it Bell in a single afternoon, the way you rename a thing you mean to sell. I read the notary line. The notary was a name I didn't recognize. Dokafor. I looked up the commission in the state database, the way you look up a part number before you trust it. It had expired in November of 2017. An expired notary had certified my father's signature on the day he transferred his life's work to a stepson who couldn't tell an escape wheel from a gear, who had scraped the case of the one clock that proved the transfer was theft. The notary's stamp was 4 months dead when it touched my father's name. That was the first crack, not the only one. The first, a movement with one cracked tooth, still runs, for a while convincingly, which is why you have to keep listening. I heard the crack now. I was going to find the rest of the break, the way you find the break by taking the whole thing apart and laying every piece on the felt. But I still didn't know the worst part. I will tell you the worst part when we get there, because a story owes its listener the worst part last, the way a restorer saves the escape wheel for the end. It's the piece that decides whether the thing lives, and you don't hand someone the decision until they've seen everything else. The conflict, when it came, did not come as a fight. Fights are what honest people have. This came as an eviction, which is what careful thieves prefer, because no one calls the police on a paperwork problem. In October of 2019, my father fell. A small fall, he caught himself on the door frame, the way a clock catches on a worn pivot and then lets go. But the hospital, looking at a brain that had been quietly failing for years, found the dementia had advanced past the point of living alone. Carolyn moved him to a memory care facility an hour away, a clean, bright building with a name like a hotel, and the particular smell of antiseptic and reheated lunch. I visited him there every Sunday still, because the location had changed and the duty had not. The room smelled of the wrong kind of quiet, not the honest quiet of a workshop, but the managed quiet of a place paid to keep the loud parts out. He didn't know the building, he asked me. The third time, where the workshop was, and I said, "It's safe," because it was the only true thing I could give him, and he said, "Good, you keep it running, Ellie," because he had reduced his whole trust in me to one instruction, and it was the right one. He died on a Tuesday, the 11th of February, 2029, 14 in the morning. The nurse said, though time had stopped, meaning much to him by then, and the clock on the wall of the memory care room had been wrong for a week and no one had fixed it, which told me everything about how the building kept time. I was the one who got the call because Carolyn was dealing with the facility, which is what she said when she meant she was dealing with the paperwork. I was the one who drove an hour in the rain because the daughter who had been excluded from the deed was still the daughter who was called first. I was the one who sat with a body that had finally, completely stopped, and I said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a man who had already told me everything he needed to, and because the silence after is its own kind of respect. I said nothing at the funeral either. Carolyn gave a reading, something about love and loss that did not mention clocks or workshops or the daughter standing 3 feet from the casket. Marcus stood beside her looking like a man who had inherited something and was deciding what to do with it, which is exactly what he was. The will was read, the 2003 will, with the 2011 codicil, the documents I had seen and loved and never doubted. And it left the house, the workshop, and the contents to me. My daughter Eleanor, who knows the clocks, the phrase my father had written. The only phrase in the whole proceeding that was completely, unforgeably true. The gift deed should have overridden that. A valid inter vivos transfer beats a will every time, the way a gear that's actually turning beats the drawing of a gear. Carolyn's lawyer laid it out calmly. The way people lay out things they believe are settled, the deed controlled. The will spoke only to what remained. What remained was the house proper, and a checking account with $400 in it. The sum total of a life reduced by a deadbolt and a dead notary. I listened. I nodded. I said, "I see." Which is what you say when you see more than the person talking does and have decided not to tell them yet. Then Marcus spoke. He had not spoken at the reading until then, content to let the lawyer be the voice of the theft. He said, "Eleanor, we want to be fair. Mom thinks you should get the electric clock, the one your mom liked, as a keepsake." He said, "Keepsake the way you say a word you've been told to say, without knowing what it costs." The electric clock, the 1962 one my mother wound. The one my father put on the high shelf the day she died. The one with no resale value and all the meaning. They were offering me the clock that proved I had loved and been loved. As if love were a consolation prize for theft. As if the daughter who knew the collection should be grateful for the one piece a thief couldn't price. I said, "That's generous." The way I say, "That's generous," to a client who brings me a clock glued together with superglue and expects me to pretend it's fine. Flat. Final. Done with the conversation before it started. Carolyn said, "We'll have the collection appraised and sold. Marcus has a buyer. A museum. They're very interested. It'll be a nice legacy for your father." And she said, "Legacy," the way a liquidator says asset, with the soft vowel doing the lying. A museum. They were going to sell my grandfather's 1923 regulator, the clock with HT&E pressed into it across a century, to a museum, through a stepson, on a deed notarized by a license that had lapsed, to a buyer who required clear title and verified provenance. Two things the deed did not have and the clocks could not honestly provide. The word legacy in Carolyn's mouth sounded exactly like liquidation, because that is what it was. I said, "Let me know how I can help," because I had already decided what kind of help I was going to be, and it was not the kind they wanted. I drove home. I did not cry in the car, because I had learned in 1,000 quiet workshops that crying doesn't fix a movement. You open it, you find the break, you repair it, you wind it, you set the time, and you let it run without you. And the running is the only grief that helps. The rain on the windshield was enough crying for both of us. I spent that night in the workshop, which was still locked, but which I could still see through the window. The regulator ticking 3:14 in the dark behind the glass, keeping the only honest time in the building. I made a list, the way my father made lists, of everything I knew and everything I needed. I knew the ledger was mine. I knew the marks were mine. I knew the notary was dead, and the signature was wrong, and the letter existed, and the emails were careless. I needed the examiner's words on paper, the museum's pause in writing, the court's docket number. I fell asleep on the bench with the list under my hand, the way a restorer sleeps next to an open movement, trusting the silence to hold until morning. It did. It always does, when the gears are in their homes. The museum buyer was real, and I found the inquiry in a forwarded email Carolyn had accidentally included me on. She forwarded everything to the family thread, and never noticed I was still on it, a careless habit that would cost her more than she spent on vegetables. The museum offered $180,000 for the lot, contingent on clear title and verified provenance, the contingency that was the whole crack in her plan, because the title was a lie and the provenance was me. Clear title, verified provenance. Those were the two things the deed did not have, and the two things I could take from her without raising my voice. I started working, not as the grieving daughter. Grief is a forced gear and it seizes the hands, but as the horologist, the person my father made, the person who knows where the pieces go. I pulled the ledger from the safe where I'd moved it the week before the funeral, because I had stopped trusting the workshop the day the deadbolt went on. I photographed every page, all 47, the serials and the dates and the marks, my father's hand and mine layered like the initials on the regulator. I photographed every clock I had ever restored, every mark I had made, every serial my father had recorded in his careful 1974 hand. I built a spreadsheet, 47 rows, one per clock, with the serial, the acquisition year, the restoration date, the mark, and the note, the kind of document a careful person builds and a careless person cannot answer. 17 of the clocks had my initials pressed into them, the tiny E only a loop would find. 11 had my father's T, 4 had my grandfather's H, the Vance regulator number. 1 had all three layered across a century, a document written in brass that no probate court could unsee once I put a loop in the right hand. That clock alone disproved the deed's premise, a clock engraved for T, who will keep it, by a man who died in 1959 could not have been my father's to give in 2018, and could not have become Marcus Bell's by a signature stamped by an expired notary. It was a Vance, it had always been a Vance. The brass said so, and the brass does not perjure itself. But a probate court does not read brass. A probate court reads paper. And the paper said Bell. So I needed more paper, better paper. The kind that proves a signature is a forgery without ever raising your voice. The way a regulating weight proves a clock is fast, without the clock admitting it. I hired a forensic document examiner. Quietly, I paid him $4,000 from savings I'd been keeping for a new lathe, the tool I'd wanted for a year and would now spend on the truth instead, which felt exactly like the kind of trade my father would have understood. He asked for signature samples, known, genuine, undoubted Theodore Vance signatures from years when his hand was steady and the loop on the V was his and not someone guiding it. I had 17 notarized appraisals from 2004, 2009, 2014, a deed to the workshop from 1986, Christmas cards to me, signed every year until 2016, the ledger's flyleaf signed in 1974 and again in 2011, the same hand at 22 and at 59, the loop intact, the slant faithful. My father had signed his name the way he wound a clock, the same pressure, the same slant, the same small loop on the V that he'd copied from his own father, and I had copied from him a signature that was itself a movement, every part in its home. The examiner compared those 17 to the signature on the 14th of March 2018 gift deed. He called me 10 days later, a Tuesday 9:14 in the morning, the same hour my father had died, which I noticed and did not mention. He said, "Miss Vance, I need to be careful with language, but this is not a match. The loop on the V is absent. The hand that wrote the deed's name could not make that loop, or didn't bother to. The pressure profile is inconsistent with a man who signed the same way for 40 years. The deed's signature presses too hard at the end, the way a guided hand does when the guide lets go. And the date, the hand that wrote 2018 shows a tremor pattern that does not appear in any of your known samples from that period, because by 2018 he wasn't writing dates at all. Your mother noted it, you noted it, the records note it, the deed denies it." He was right about the last part, and the last part was the proof. My father stopped writing dates in 2017, the year the dementia took the part of him that ordered the world into days. Carolyn wrote them for him, the careful hand finishing what his could no longer. The deed's date had been written by someone else, and the name under it had been guided, or forged, or both, the way a forced gear is pushed by a hand that doesn't belong to the movement. I had my second crack. The notary was expired. The signature was not his. Two cracks in a movement that had been presented as running true, and a movement with two cracks does not run. It limps. And a limping movement is a movement a careful person can stop. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the money. And money is the part of every theft that explains the theft. Because people rarely forge deeds for sentiment. They forge them because someone is owed, and the someone always finds out. I went looking for where the money had gone, because a theft this clean always has a destination. The way a forced gear always has a load, it wasn't built to carry. You don't forge a deed to a clock collection for the love of clocks. You do it because the collection is liquid, and someone owes someone. And the someone who owes has found a way to pay with what was never theirs. I found the destination in the only place Carolyn thought was safe, the family thread emails, which she still forwarded me on, bless her careless habits. The habits that had already given me the auction email and would now give me the rest. Marcus owed $90,000 to a lender I will not name except to say it was the kind of lender that sends people to your door instead of your inbox, the kind that treats a missed payment as a personal betrayal and a debt as a leash. The debt was from a failed consulting venture in 2017, the kind of venture that consists mostly of the word consulting and the money of other people. Carolyn had been quietly paying the interest, $11,000 across 9 months, from my father's checking account, which she controlled as power of attorney, the kind of control that turns a vulnerable adult's money into a son's second chance repeatedly, until the adult is gone and the chance has cost everyone but the son. Then the lender wanted the principal. Carolyn could not pay it. The vegetables and the labels had not built any wealth, only the appearance of order. So the clocks became the plan. The gift deed moved the collection to Marcus. Marcus would sell to the museum for $180,090 to the lender, to make the doorstoppers stop. The rest, $90,000, a cruel echo of the debt, to Carolyn and Marcus, free and clear, while the daughter who knew the clocks got the electric one, as a keepsake. The math was clean, the morality was not, the legality was the part I was about to dismantle, gear by gear. I read those emails on a Thursday night. The workshop heater was off. I'd turned it down the way you turn down a thing you're no longer sure is yours. The room was 58 degrees, colder than my father ever allowed, and I held the ledger in my lap, and I felt for the first time something like anger. Not the loud kind that breaks screws, the kind that sits low and steady, the kind that makes you set a movement with absolute precision because you refuse to let your hands shake, because the shake is the only thing that can ruin the repair. Here is the truth the deed was built to hide, and it is the truth that turns a theft into a failure. My father had, in a clearer moment in 2016, before the dementia took the dates while the loop on the V was still his, added a provision to his records. Not the will, a separate letter of wishes he drafted with a different attorney, the one who handled the 2011 codicil, the one Carolyn had not thought to control. In that letter he wrote, in his own steady hand, the loop intact, the slant faithful. The Vance collection is not to be sold, it is to pass to Eleanor, who knows it. If it is ever sold, the proceeds go to the County Horological Trust for restoration education, so that some other child without a father can learn what mine taught me. He named me steward, he named the trust beneficiary. He did not name Marcus, he did not name Carolyn. He had, in his clearer moment, anticipated exactly the thing they did, the way a good restorer anticipates the failure a movement is headed for, and builds the stop to catch it. Carolyn had the letter. She'd found it among his papers, the way you find the one document that defeats you. She had not mentioned it, because the letter defeated the deed. A man cannot gift what he had already, on paper, dedicated to a trust he controlled through his daughter, the way a gear cannot be both turning and stopped. The letter was a wish, not a binding instrument. Her lawyer would argue it was advisory, the soft word again, the word that dresses a fact as a feeling. But a wish, paired with a forged signature and an expired notary and a daughter who could read brass, is enough to pause a sale and open a case, the way a small weight is enough to stop a fast clock if you put it on the right pivot. I had the letter photographed before she could misplace it, the way I'd photographed everything else. Because misplacing is what careful thieves do to documents that defeat them, and photographing is what careful daughters do to documents that save them. I had the emails, I had the examiner's report, I had the notary's expired commission pulled from the state database, time-stamped, the digital fingerprint of a license that had died 4 months before it touched my father's name. I had the ledger, all 47 pages, every mark, every serial, every date in my father's hand and mine. I had the clock with 3 generations of initials pressed into it where no court could unsee them once I put a loop in the judge's hand, the way you put the escape wheel in the examiner's hand and let the truth speak in its own small voice. The emails told a timeline as clean as a movement diagram. March 2018, the gift deed signed or forged while my father could no longer write the loop on the VGARS. April through December 2018. Carolyn paid 9,000 of the 11,000 in interest. 9 payments of roughly 1,000 each, from the checking account she controlled carefully, the way you launder a theft into a line item. January 2019. Marcus's lender demanded the 90,000 principal, the demand that turned a slow bleed into a plan. February 2019. The new deadbolt, the locked door, the kitchen Sundays. June 2019. The auction estimate, up to 200,000, the number that assumed I would never be CC'd. August 2019. The museum's inquiry, contingent on clear title, the contingency that was the whole crack. February 2020. My father died, and the plan accelerated, because a dead man can't be asked whether he meant it. I laid that timeline next to the ledger, and the 2 documents disagreed about everything except one fact. The clocks were Vance, the Vances were still here, and the bells were about to learn that you cannot forge a century. What Carolyn didn't know was that brass remembers. What she didn't know was that I had spent my whole life learning to read what other people threw away: the scraped case, the expired notary, the guided signature, the careless forward. What she didn't know was that the quiet daughter was the only person in the room who had been keeping the record the entire time, the only one who could prove the silence had been documented, the only one who had laid every piece on the felt. The worst part wasn't the lying, it was the timing. She had waited until he couldn't defend himself, and then she had told the world he had defended her son. The cruelest forgery of all. Not a signature, but a character. Not a name, but a father. Rewritten into a man who feared his daughter and favored a stranger. That is the part I will not forgive, and the part I did not need to forgive out loud, because the record forgave nothing and proved everything, and the record is louder than any apology. I set the regulator 314, exactly, the way it had been for 100 years and would be for 100 more, and then I did what a horologist does when a movement has been forced, when the gear that was never built to turn has been made to turn anyway, when the whole thing has seized under a load it wasn't meant to carry. I opened the case. I did not scream. I did not post. I did not call Carolyn and tell her what I knew, because telling a thief what you found is the fastest way to lose the evidence. They will burn the ledger you photographed. They will misplace the letter you copied. They will become, suddenly, the careful ones. I kept the silence I'd practiced for a year, and I turned it into the weapon it had always been. I built a packet. A horologist rebuilding a movement lays out every part in order on a felt mat. Escape wheel, pallet fork, mainspring, barrel, each where it belongs, nothing skipped, nothing rushed. So that when you close the case, the whole thing turns as it was always meant to. You don't argue with a movement, you arrange it. My packet was that felt mat, and the arrangement was the argument. Page 1. The gift deed, recorded, dated the 14th of March 2018, transferring the collection and the workshop from Theodore Vance to Marcus Bell. Page 2. The notary's commission, expired November 2017, pulled from the state registry, 4 months dead before it touched my father's name. Page 3. The forensic examiner's report, 17 known signatures, the absent V-loop, the guided pressure, the tremor that wasn't his, the date he couldn't have written. Page 4. The letter of wishes, 2016, his steady hand, the loop intact, naming me steward and the trust beneficiary, the document that made the deed a contradiction. Page 5. The emails, Marcus's 90,000 debt, Carolyn's 11,000 in interest paid from my father's account. The museum offer contingent on clear title, the contingency they could not meet. Page 6 through 52. The ledger, all 47 clocks. Every serial, every mark, every restoration date, with photographs of the marks pressed into brass, including the Vance regulator. Number 1 with HT&E layered across a century, the document no forger could write because no forger had been there in 1923, or 1965, or 2009. I sent the packet to 3 places, the way you send a regulating weight to the 3 pivots that decide the rate. First, to the museum's acquisitions committee, with a calm 1-page cover note that did not accuse, only informed, Before you release $180,000, you should know the title is contested, the notary was expired at signing, and the signature is under examination by a forensic document examiner. I am the named steward of this collection under a 2016 letter of wishes. I would hate for an institution I respect to buy a lawsuit it could have avoided for the price of an email. I attached the notary record and the examiner's summary. Institutions respond to informed risk faster than to anger because anger is a story and risk is a number, and numbers are what institutions speak. The museum paused the purchase the same week, and the $90,000 to the lender plan lost its buyer, the way a forced gear loses its load when you remove the hand that was forcing it. Second, to the probate court as a formal objection to the deed's control over the estate, with the packet as Exhibit A through L filed correctly because I had spent a weekend learning probate procedure the way I'd once learned escapements, slowly, from a book, without shame, because pride is a forced gear and it seizes the learner. The objection named the expired notary, the examined signature, the letter of wishes, and the ledger, and it asked the court to void the deed and return the collection to the estate, where the 2003 will and the 2011 codicil, the documents Carolyn couldn't rewrite, would govern. Third, to Carolyn's own lawyer, with a single line that was not a threat, only a deadline. I believe the deed is void for failure of notarial authority and signature irregularity. I would prefer to resolve this without involving the lender you've been paying from a vulnerable adult's account. I'll wait 14 days. 14 days. Long enough to mean business. Short enough to show I wasn't bluffing, the way you give a fast clock 14 days to prove it can't be regulated before you replace the faulty pivot. Carolyn called me on day 3. She was not smooth this time. The practice had fallen out of the words. She said, "Eleanor, you don't understand. Your father wanted peace in the family. He didn't want to fight." And there it was, the word, fight. The thing she'd spent a year preventing me from starting, now offered to me as if I were the one who'd begun it. I said, then he shouldn't have signed a deed he couldn't read, with a notary who'd lost her license 4 months before she stamped his name. She said, "That's not fair." I said, "The museum paused the sale this morning. The court has the packet. You have 11 days to decide whether you want a quiet correction or a public one. I'd choose quiet for Marcus's sake, and for the lenders who I suspect would be very interested to learn the collateral was never clear. But that's your call, not mine." I named the lender loosely, the way you name a weight you're about to place, and let her imagine the rest. I hung up. I did not raise my voice. Raising your voice is what you do when you're not sure the mechanism will hold, when you need the volume to do the work, the facts won't. I was sure. The facts were the facts. Arranged on the felt, every gear in its home. On day 9, her lawyer called mine. I'd hired one by then, a probate specialist who read the packet and said, "This is clean. Who laid this out?" And I said, "A horologist." And he laughed and said, "Figures every part in its place. Most clients bring me a pile. You brought me a movement." That was the highest compliment I'd gotten in a year, and it came from a man who'd seen 1,000 piles and never a movement, and it told me I'd done the job the way my father taught me. We settled quietly, the way the best restorations end. No drama, just the thing running again. The deed was voided for failure of notarial authority and signature irregularity, the 2 cracks I'd found, now official. The collection returned to the estate, where the 2003 will and the 2011 codicil governed. The documents Carolyn couldn't rewrite because they were mine before she arrived. The 2016 letter of wishes was honored as the controlling intent. I became steward. The trust was named beneficiary of any future sale, which meant there would be no future sale because I am the steward, and I will not sell what my grandfather built, the way you don't sell the thing you were charged to keep running. Carolyn kept the house proper, the will's residue, such as it was, the $400 and the rooms, and I kept the workshop and the 47 clocks and the ledger and the truth. Marcus kept his debt, which became, after the sale fell through, very much his problem and very much not mine. The lender, I am told, was less gentle than I was, because the doorstoppers do not respond to silence, only to the missing payment. The 90,000 plan collapsed under its own load, the way a forced gear always does, and the people who'd forced it were left holding the thing they'd tried to move, which turned out to be nothing. What I did with the workshop, once it was mine in the only way that counts, on paper and in brass, was open it on a Tuesday. The day he died, at 9:14, and wind every clock he could no longer reach. I didn't hold a ceremony, I held a mainspring. The County Horological Trust got its letter of intent, the one the 2016 wishes required, naming the beneficiary but leaving me steward, which means the collection will never be sold while I draw breath, and will pass, when I'm gone, not to a belle but to a child who learns where the screws are. I hired a young restorer, a girl of 19 who reminds me of me, and I taught her to read a serial before a chapter book, and to count a lost screw with a magnet, and to press her initial where only a loop will find it. The charge passes, that's the whole point of a movement. Not that it runs forever, but that it runs long enough to teach the next hand where the gears go. Carolyn sent me one email, the last she'd send me, the kind of sentence a person writes when they've lost and want to be the one who ended it. Your father would be disappointed in the distance between us. I read it in the workshop at 64 degrees, the regulator ticking 314, the felt mat still on the bench from the night I'd laid out the packet. I thought about the deadbolt, now gone, the 1924 hardware back on the door where it belonged. I thought about the scrape on the case, now repaired, the mark of a hand that hadn't known where the screws were. I thought about the 90,000 and the 11 and the expired notary and the forged V and the letter she'd hidden and the Sundays she'd moved to the kitchen. I wrote back, he'd be disappointed. I waited 11 months to open the case. I won't make that mistake again. I did not send it. Some movements are better left unwound, the way some sentences are better left unspoken, because the speaking is the forcing and the silence is the repair. I kept the draft in the ledger, the way my father kept everything, and I let the clock tick. That is the revenge, if you want to call it that, though. I don't, not a scream. A restoration. I took the thing they forced to stop, the trust, the collection, the truth, the father they'd rewritten, and I put every gear back where it belonged, and I let it run without me, the way a good restoration disappears into the ticking. They wanted a liquid asset. They got a daughter who reads brass. They wanted me erased. They got a record they could not forge, a clock they could not price, a silence that turned out to be the loudest thing in the room. A forced gear seizes. A true one turns. I am the true one, so is the clock. So, in the end, was my father, who had charged me to keep it running, and who, even at the end, when he called me by my mother's name, had known exactly which daughter was the one who stayed. I restored the Vance regulator number 1. Again. This spring. Not because it needed it. It runs beautifully, 314, every afternoon, the way it has for 100 years and will for 100 more. The truest thing in any room I've ever been in. I restored it because my hands needed the ritual, the way they do when the year has been long and the silence has been earned. I took it apart, 214 pieces. I counted them twice, the way my father taught me, once for the number and once for the habit, because the habit is the inheritance and the number is just the count. I found my E inside the barrel arbor, exactly where I'd left it in 2009, untouched by the deed, by the deadbolt, by the expired notary, by anyone who'd never taken the clock apart. I found my father's T on the pendulum bob, steady as the day he charged me. I found my grandfather's H on the escape wheel, cut by a hand that had been dead for 60 years and was still, in some sense I can't explain and don't need to, turning the clock. 3 generations pressed into brass, where no one but a restorer would ever look. Where no deed, no thief, no expired notary, no probate court could ever reach, because you cannot forge what you have not lived, and you cannot steal what you cannot see, and you cannot stop a clock whose every gear is in the home, a century of hands gave it. There's a windmill figurine on the workbench that my mother bought at a flea market in 1981, a small brass thing that turned when you blew on it, which she said was the only machine she trusted because it only moved when the world moved it. I restored it the week after the settlement, not because it was broken, but because I needed to prove to myself that some things still turn only when you ask the air to. It sits by the regulator now, and when the heater kicks on and the warm air rises, it turns slowly, the way my father's Atmos did, the way a house should not forced, not sold, not signed away by a hand that wasn't there, but moved by the simple fact of being kept. The tall case clock chimes at the hour. The electric clock my mother loved sits on the sunroom windowsill again, where she left it, wound every Sunday by me. The spring no longer groaning under a 6-year-old's grief, but steady, under a 44-year-old's promise. Don't let it stop, he said. I haven't, I won't. The workshop is open again. The deadbolt is gone. The 1924 hardware is back. The strike plate honest. The welcome real. On Sundays now I don't visit a grave or a memory care room with a wrong clock on the wall. I go to the workshop. I wind the clocks my father could no longer reach, The tall case, the 40-pound one, the one that needs the step stool he was no longer allowed to climb, and I am. I log them in the ledger, now mine to keep, my hand next to his, the loop on the V finally shared the way it was always meant to be. And at 3:14 every afternoon the regulator ticks, and for 1 second the room is exactly as it was when I was 9 and he was humming and the world was a movement with every gear in its home. And the silence is the first kind, the held breath before the pendulum drops, not the second kind, the one you carry out of the room, because this silence breaks, the way the good ones do, into ticking. You don't have to defeat anyone to win, you just have to be the one who knows where the pieces go and refuse to let them be forced out of place. The person who screams is the person who isn't sure the mechanism will hold. The person who is sure simply closes the case and lets it run, and the running is the only answer a forced gear can't survive. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I've got a story about a woman who restored her grandmother's music box and found a will hidden in the cylinder. A story where the secret was in the mechanism and not the paper, the way it always is when a family tries to hide what it should have kept. And tell me in the comments what time it is where you are, and whether there's a clock in the next room ticking for someone you lost, because I read them, every one, and I know exactly how that feels, the way you know the feel of a true movement under your thumb. Steady, warm, home. The ticking doesn't stop because we do, it stops when someone stops winding it, so wind it, keep it running. That's the whole job, and it's the only one that matters, and it's the one my father gave me and I'm giving you. The way a charge passes from one set of hands to the next, the way the initials pass from H to T to E, the way a gear that's in its home turns and turns and turns, long after the hands that placed it are gone.